Hey, hey, can you help me out real quick? I'm about to do this video, and there's this phrase in Exodus. I don't know how to say it. It's wilderness of sin, I think. Wilderness of sin. Yeah, can you just look that up for me real quick? Yeah, sin, S-I-N. Okay. Yeah, I thought that might be a little too on the nose, but it is kind of funny. Wilderness of seen? Seen. I'd rather say sin than seen. I don't like that one. Sounds weird. Wilderness of sign. Oh, because of Sinai. Yeah. Wilderness of sign. Is there any other ones? Sine. Cosine. Tangent. Oh, okay. You know what? Thank you for your help. So glad I called, and thanks for everything. Okay. Oh, hello there. Welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. Today we will be in Exodus chapter 16, and this is the great and famous text about God providing the manna and quail in the wilderness. So if you haven't had a chance to do so already, take some time to read through Exodus chapter 16. We will have already gone through the first 10 verses or so in our assembly, and we'll catch some of the highlights in the second half of the chapter here as well. But it's good to read through the whole thing if you get a chance. All right, so we begin with the people having gone through the Exodus and now entered into across the sea and into the wilderness. We come now a month later, a month after the Exodus event. The text says that they came into the wilderness of Sinai, the region around what is Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and the whole congregation in verse 2, all of the people of Israel began to grumble against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. So the scene is that they come onto maybe the border of this wilderness, and when they look out across the vast arid desert, the prospects are not good, and something happens, as it would, as you might expect, in their minds and their hearts. Some people uh, some people suggest that maybe they had run out of the food. You know, it's been a month, and the people have run out of food that they came out of Egypt with, and now they're faced with this vast desert in front of them, with uh, having run out of food, and so they begin to grumble against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, and recalling the great glory days of Egypt. Remember those great days when we used to have all the food, all of the meat, all the bread that we wanted, and it was so awesome there. Because now they're faced with a situation where they're afraid they won't have any of that food. Okay, so verse 4 in chapter 16, the Lord says to Moses, and this is a private conversation here, verses 4 and 5. The Lord says to Moses, "Behold, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven for you, and the people will go out and gather a day's portion every day, so that I will test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." All right. So that was just the short instructions to Moses. Now Moses and Aaron in verse 6 then speak to all the whole of Israel, all the people there, and they say, "In the evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you'll see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you're grumbling against us?" So Moses goes on to tell them that God's going to provide. And in verse 9, Moses and Aaron say, say to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, Moses says this to Aaron, say to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumblings. And it came about as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, that they turned to look towards the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. Okay, so that's the setup here. And so I just want to make 2 or 3 observations about the text as I try to do in something like a sermon. A couple of things, a couple of ideas and things to be thinking about. The first one is this theme here of grumbling and glory. I don't even know how many times the word grumbling comes up in the text here, but it's a lot. You heard it repeated several times. That's an issue here. Now, you may ask the question, how can these people grumble when a month earlier they just saw God do all this stuff and the big plagues and the Exodus and all that? Well, right, that's a good question, but that's part of the point. And it's part of the point that is being made for the reader as well. Because not everyone, I mean, even the people that took part in that, somehow they have not forgotten. Obviously, they recall it, but it hasn't made an impact on the way they are interpreting the present circumstances. How much more than people afterwards, generations later, hearing this story as they would, parents, grandparents, and children, grandchildren, sitting around telling this story, their story of how they came to be, of how God redeemed them. How much more those people in those latter generations and situations, how this story would have an impact on them, because surely they are in situations where it will be easy to grumble and difficult to understand that the glory of the Lord is in their midst. And that's the first reflection here. The grumbling versus the glory. God says, prepare the people, they're going to see my glory. Tomorrow morning I'm going to show that. And then here, there's some difficult chronology issues here in the text, but verse 10, Aaron speaks to the whole congregation, and they look out into the wilderness, and they see the glory of the Lord. Okay, so that's the big point. And the wilderness kind of represents the future, the thing that they're walking into, right? And it's the great unknown. You don't know what's going to happen there, but it certainly isn't promising. What do you see when you look out into a vast wilderness and you have no food and no resources, and we're supposed to just travel through there? It looks bleak. It looks barren. It looks harrowing. It looks hostile. This is not a place where it's going to be easy to trust God. And so God gives them this vision of his glory, the glory of the Lord. And that's the first time that we encounter this phrase in the Hebrew Bible. These 2 verses, verse 10, and a couple of verses earlier as well. But this chapter, we're hearing about the glory of the Lord. Okay, this is an important revelation, and this phrase is occurring for the first time, the glory of the Lord. Well, he shows that, reveals that to them in the wilderness, and it's important where that's appearing. Aaron says, look out towards the wilderness, and what do you see? The glory of the Lord, his sustaining presence. The glory of the Lord is his presence, his faithful, sustaining presence. And it's already there in the wilderness. And that's the first and one of the major points of the text. Yeah, the wilderness looks, in the future, looks difficult. And all of the doomsdayers and all of the naysayers are having a field day. Oh, we should have stayed in Egypt. Why did God bring us out here to kill us? Why don't you just do that back in Egypt? Why do you bring us through this whole charade just for us to have the same fate out here in the wilderness? Yeah, it's going to be the end of the world, and whatever those people are going to say. But God says, "My glory is already out there in the wilderness, in the future, that looks bleak, that looks harrowing, that looks hostile, that looks dangerous, that looks hopeless, but it's already there." And if you can come to understand that and trust that, you'll be able to take those steps into that future, into that wilderness, and know that God's presence and his sustenance is already there to see you through. And that's the message that God wants to give to the people here. Okay, so that's the first reflection. Grumbling versus glory. What do we focus on? What do our eyes see when we look into the future? Secondly, is this thing about testing and tasting. In verse 6, God says he's going to rain down bread from heaven. And part of the reason here, obviously, the main reason is to take care of the people, but part of the reason is that I may test them, he says, whether or not they will walk in my instruction. Now, if we say God is testing them to see whether they will trust him, I think that's an okay thing to say, but I think we're kind of jumping over a step there in the process, because it's not just to test them to see if they will have faith or trust in God. The text says, I'm going to test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. So what is the instruction? Well, the one that they're going to receive here in chapter 10 is a specific instruction of what to do with this manna that we're about to talk about in a second here. What to do with it, in particular, not just every morning, but in particular on the 6th and 7th mornings. And it's really a text that introduces the Sabbath. Before we get the law, Israel receives this Sabbath command in the wilderness. So the Sabbath is going to be highlighted first and foremost here, chapters before we ever get to the 10 Commandments and the command for the Sabbath. So we're going to learn about what the Sabbath is in this text by this manna in this test. And so part of the test is really going to be about the Sabbath. And what is the Sabbath about? That's about trusting in God. The point and purpose, one of the main points and purposes of Sabbath, is about resting, of course. And in that rest, we're trusting in God to provide, and we're reminding ourselves that we are not God and that he is. So eventually, yes, we get to the point where we say the test is about trusting in God. But the way we get there is via the Sabbath. And that's what this story is about in large part. So, testing and Sabbath. Now, what is it that is going to be falling from heaven that's going to test them? It's this thing called manna. This next section here, verses 11 and following, talks about how in verse 13, it came about at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. So there's quails and there's dew. The quail come in and they wake up and there's a bunch of quail around. But the main point of the text here is about what happens with the dew. And verse 14 says, when the layer of dew evaporated, literally had gone up, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. Now that translation is as good as any. It's kind of mystery text to translate what exactly is being described here. But eventually we come to verse 15 where it says, the sons of Israel, when they saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, it's the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Now that phrase there, what is it, is going to be a play on words with the word manna. And what is it is two Hebrew words. It's man and hu, and that's a phrase that means what is it, right? Just like it says. but that first part, the man, is the what becomes this word for manna. When we say it, like in verse 31, it will say the word manna. The house of Israel called it manna. All right. So in English, we say manna, M-A-N-N-A, or manna, however you want to say it. Now, we call it that, and it's translated that way in English because that's the way that the Greek text spells it. Not in this text, but in other places in the Torah, it will spell it as manna. So that's why we call it manna. That's what we're used to calling it. But in Hebrew, it's just man, like the first part of the word, and it's related. The text makes this etymological connection with the question, "What is it?" Which I think is really funny, and that's why this is one of my favorite scenes. Because when you're thinking about what do we call the bread that God made fall from heaven, you'd think it would receive some sort of name like Hallelujah bread or something like that, right? This should have a really awesome name. It's this miraculous bread that falls from heaven. The name that it gets though is not Hallelujah bread. It's what is that? What is it? Which I think is funny. So, and it's kind of like one of those scenes where you're with your kids around the dinner table, and it happens all the time. You know, there's some mystery dish that comes out of nowhere. It's on the table. Um, you know what it is as the parents, and you know that it's good, but they have no idea what it was and what it is, and they don't really want anything to do with it. And their response is kind of like the one in the text here. Oh, what is that? And as a parent, you're kind of like, it's from God. Just eat it, okay? And that's kind of kind of what I see happening here between Moses and the people. They this thing appears in the morning. Uh, they say, "What is that?" And Moses says, "It's the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. So just eat it, okay?" I don't think he had that kind of tone, but it's funny to imagine those situations. It's a great scene though. But what is this stuff? Manna. The text presents it as originating in the dew of heaven. So what's depicted here is that this heaven, or this dew from heaven, descends in the morning and falls onto the ground, and within those, within each drop of dew, there is this thing that the text describes as a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. And in verse 31, Israel names it manna, and it was like coriander seed, except white, and it tastes like wafers with honey. I brought a little jar of coriander seed. I think we got this in about 1987. You can tell that we use it often. But, this is, the text says, if coriander seeds were white, it would have looked something like that. But it didn't taste like, it looked kind of like this, but it was white, and it didn't taste like that. It tastes kind of like wafers with honey. And the honey that's being described here is not like honey that comes from bees, the honey that we're used to, but it's kind of the syrup or molasses that you would get from dates or grapes. That they would have called that honey, but it's something sweet. Um, Same thing when it comes to the land flowing with milk and honey. I don't know. I don't think that's probably talking about honey from bees, but this kind of honey, the syrup stuff that you get from the grapes or the dates or something like that. But it's something sweet, right? And so it tastes kind of like that, kind of like wafers that are sweet, and it kind of looks like coriander seeds if they were white, and it's kind of like a fine flake-like thing, like frost on the ground. But the point is, however they want to describe it, and also interesting of note, if you ever get a chance, look up honeydew, not the melon, but the secretion from insects. That's some interesting reading there. A lot of people connect it with that. All right, if you want to get a better idea of maybe what's being described here. Anyway, but the text says that there's this dew that comes in the morning that originates from heaven, and this thing that originates in heaven, what is it? I don't know, but let's just call it that. What is it? Manna. Um, it comes down in those drops of dew, settles on the ground, and then the drops of dew return back up to heaven, and what's left on the ground is this substance, what is called manna, and that's the thing that God is miraculously providing for the people day by day by day, and He provides just enough for what everyone needs each day, what each person, what each family needs every day. They all collect it. Some of them collect a little bit, some of them collect a lot, it says in verse 17. But in the end, in verse 18, when everyone measures it with the standard measurement, the one who gathered a lot didn't have any excess, and the one who gathered very little had no lack. So whatever they're doing in the gathering, God kind of makes it happen so that everyone gets what they need. So maybe the amounts are changed in the process here when somehow by God, kind of reminiscent of if you only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, but somehow it is miraculously providing for all that is needed. So that's what happens every day, except for on the 6th day, when you're supposed to gather twice as much. And that is because of the Sabbath. Now, when the Sabbath comes, you are not going to be gathering, you're not going to be cooking or making any stuff or doing any sort of labor or work. You will have done all that preparation the day before. And so you're going to gather double the amount on the 6th day so that on the 7th, on the Sabbath, you'll have enough. And that's the test, God says. In verse 28, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? Because some people found out that when they had tried to keep stuff longer than they should have, it just kind of turns gross right away, and so on and so forth. You can read more about that in the text. But some people are trying to, wondering, is this, do we need to try to take a little bit extra to make sure it lasts? And then also with the Sabbath command, there's some issues there. And part of it might be because Moses didn't relay the information well enough to the people. He's kind of like, oh yeah, God said you're supposed to pick up double on the 6th day, and there's not going to be anything there on the morning of the 7th day. So you need to get it all on the 6th day and honor these commands. And then on the 7th day, in the sacred space of the Sabbath, the food does last. It is preserved, just like it would be preserved in the sacred space of the Ark of the Covenant, which they placed a small collection of this manna substance in the Ark of the Covenant. That's what happens at the end of the chapter here. And so it's preserved in the sacred space of the Ark of the Covenant, just as it's preserved in the sacred space of the Sabbath day, because those have special connection to the sacred space of heaven where this substance originates in the first place. So the Sabbath and the Ark of the Covenant are these pieces of heaven where the manna is at home. And so the people are to honor this command and trust in God along the way. So that's really kind of the main 2 parts of the text here: grumbling versus glory. I think that's really worth reflecting on in our own lives. How much am I grumbling about the present state, or especially the future state, what is unknown, what I'm anticipating, versus seeing that God's glory and God's presence is already there, to see me, to see us through, to provide. And then testing, tasting, the things that we just talked about here. Um, a huge question about, am I willing to trust and honor and walk in the instruction of the Lord? And finally, as we hear this story, there's obvious connections to uh, this idea of bread from heaven and Jesus. And this is the third and final thing we can reflect on today. And I'm going to leave most of that up to you, individually or for your household, to reflect on today, because there's so much here, and I think it's worth really taking some time to meditate on your own. What connections do you see between the life and the ministry and the miracles and the purpose of Jesus and this text here? Some of those connections are made for us overtly in the texts of the Gospels. Jesus says that he's the bread of life. There's connections between Jesus and the bread of life and bread of heaven, that sort of thing. But let's take some time today to really reflect on that more deeply. What does that mean, and how does that manifest itself in our daily life? And of course, there's also connections to the communion, the Lord's Supper that we share in together every week, that the church across the world shares in every week. What connections do we see between this concept of God, of having faith in God, about God's sustenance and glory, and the Lord's Supper? I think there's a lot to reflect on there, a lot to excavate as far as the connections between this text and the Lord's Supper, about the glory of God, the presence of God that we have within us, and the substance from heaven that is manifest in this world and sustains and guides and leads and empowers and gives life. And all of that's represented in this meal that we celebrate together as a church. And there's much more than that as well. So I invite you to reflect on both the connections with the Lord's Supper and the connections with Jesus himself and who he is, with this text in Exodus 16. Blessings to you on this Lord's Day.